In this video we will talk about the low-cut filter, which looks like a simple tool on the surface, but once you get to know it you will find that it's surprisingly useful for more than just cutting low end. My name is Thomas and I have been mastering records professionally for more than 20 years. I run a mastering company together with Sofia. On this channel we talk about audio mastering, so let's go! A low-cut filter has two main parameters, the cutoff frequency and the steepness. The filter will attenuate frequencies below the cutoff frequency, and it will let higher frequencies pass through without attenuation. Low-cut filters are also called high-pass filters because of this, because low frequencies are cut and high frequencies pass through. A perfect low-cut filter would remove everything below the cutoff frequency and it would leave everything above the cutoff unchanged, but that's not the case in reality. A normal low-cut filter that is used for audio will instead have a gradual drop-off below the cutoff frequency, and it will start slightly above. And this drop-off has a steepness that is measured in decibels per octave. And in this case, the steepness is 6 dB per octave, and this is the most gentle low-cut filter type that you will normally find in an equalizer. The 6 dB per octave filter is sometimes called a first-order filter. The steepness can usually be increased in steps of 6, and each such increase will also increase the order of the filter. So a 12 dB per octave filter is also called a second-order filter. 18 dB per octave is a third-order filter, and so on. For mastering I will almost always use either a 6 or a 12 dB per octave filter. And the most common use of a low-cut filter in mastering is to remove things that are very low in frequency but doesn't add to the music. And for this you can use a 12 dB per octave filter and set the frequency to be as low as possible, so that it removes the rumble but not the actual music. If you want more control over the low end, then there's often a Q value to adjust as well. Not all low-cut filters have a Q value available, but if it does, then you can use that to boost or cut around the cutoff frequency. Low Q values will attenuate more around the cutoff, and higher Q values will boost at the cutoff frequency. In order to use the Q value, you will need a filter that is at least 12 dB per octave or steeper. First-order filters don't have Q values. The neutral position is usually a Q value of 0.71, but in some equalizers the neutral position can be another value instead. I sometimes tweak the Q value if I need to place the cutoff higher up and cut into the music in order to reduce the rumble. Then a bit of boost at the cutoff frequency can help to keep the overall energy of the low end. And this is quite similar to having an additional peak band, although with less control over the gain and the shape of the boost. If the low end both have rumble and is a bit too loud, then a lower Q value can be used to both reduce the rumble and to reduce the overall energy. This behaves quite similar to having an additional wide peak band for cutting. I generally use the Q value for reducing low end more than I use it for boosting, but most of the time I will leave it at the neutral position. And cutting lows is probably the most intuitive use of a low-cut filter, but it can also be used for adding more bass, or at least make the bass more easy to perceive. Here is a manufactured and quite exaggerated example of a problem that pops up from time to time in mastering. It is a mix with a loud kick drum that has a lot of low end. The problem is that once you try to increase the loudness with a peak limiter, then the low end disappears. You might find some limiter setting that sounds kind of okay, but the sound will be thinner no matter what you do. Here I am reducing the output of the limiter as well so that we can hear what the limiter is doing without the increase in loudness. And the best solution would be to back off the level and not peak limit as much, and that's usually the right answer in these situations. But there might be reasons as to why you would want to make the master louder than its optimal loudness, and there is a way to fix this that will almost always work to some extent. And the paradoxical solution is to use a low-cut filter before the peak limiter. Listen to what happens when I enable this low-cut filter. You will want to listen in headphones or speakers with good enough bass response to hear this. The low end is more present after peak limiting with the filter enabled. What is happening here? Well, the problem with the mix is that the kick drum contains a lot of low end energy, but all of this energy is released pretty much instantly. It's a very short kick drum sound. So when the limiter slams down on the peaks of each kick, then all of the low end in the kick gets reduced as well. These kinds of mixes are almost impossible to make loud without losing the low end energy. What the low cut filter is doing in this case is that it introduces phase shift to the signal. This phase shift is mostly affecting the frequencies around the cutoff frequency, and phase shift in this context is the same as delay. The more phase shift, the more delay. And the steep filter in this example is introducing a lot of phase shift. I have exaggerated the effect in order to demonstrate this, but this is a situation where I would use sharper filters than I would normally do. So the magic that happens is that the kick drum gets extended in time. The lowest frequencies in the kick drum gets delayed compared to the upper parts. There is still the same amount of energy, but it's released over a longer period of time. So when the limiter slams down on the initial transient, there is still some low end left to be heard when it releases the gain reduction. And this makes it much easier to find a limiter setting that keeps the mix sounding both deep, fat and clean. As you probably can tell, the sound of the low end also changes. The distinct, snappy character of the mix is turned into a fatter, bigger sounding low end. And if you are mastering your own mix, then you can simply decide for yourself if this is an acceptable trade-off. But if you are mastering a mix for a client, then you need to be aware that this might be a bigger change than what they will accept. They might also love it. Here is a trick that can make the low end sound more focused. If there are stereo bass instruments in the mix, then this can add width and fullness to the sound. But if there's too much width in the low end, then the sound can be too wide and the low end is all over the place. If that is the case, then you can narrow the low end by placing a low cut filter in the side signal only. This will gradually make the low end below the cutoff frequency mono, and the bass will sound more focused and centered. Many equalizers can be set to affect only the side signal. In Equilibrium from DMG Audio, you can set this for each band, so just set the stereo mode of a high-pass band to side and you're good to go. In TDR Nova, you can set the stereo mode of the whole instance to side, so you will need to use a separate instance of Nova for tweaking the side signal only. When reducing the low end width in this way, I prefer to use first order filters that have this gentle 6 dB per octave slope. Steeper slopes will introduce more phase shift, and this will affect how you perceive the stereo image and sometimes also the position of instruments in the mix. First order filters are generally quite safe to use without altering the perceived stereo image too much, so I would recommend that as a starting point. When cutting vinyl records, the cutting engineer will sometimes choose to mono the low end, and a very common way to do this is to use a 6 dB per octave filter in the side signal, placed at either 150 Hz or 300 Hz. That's in fact what the standard elliptical filter in a Neumann disc cutting console is doing. So if you're going to send your master to vinyl cutting, then it can be a good thing to check what it would sound like with a narrow low end. If you lose important musical content when doing this, then you have a problem with mono compatibility. And this is a good thing to fix whether you are making vinyl records or not. But if it sounds good, or at least okay, with the filter enabled, then you know that your low end will sound good on vinyl as well. At least when it comes to the stereo information. Just remember to remove the filter from the master unless it actually makes the master sound better. It's usually better to leave this decision to the cutting engineer, since it might not be needed at all. Whenever you are equalizing the mid and the side signal differently, then the perception of width, depth and ambience in the mix will be affected. So pay close attention to what happens in regards to these things so that you don't lose the sense of room and depth. If you want some more mastering tips, then I suggest that you get our free PDF 5 mastering strategies using free plugins. There you will get some great strategies that I use all the time when I'm mastering, as well as some tips on free plugins. You will find the link in the description. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.